So this last unit we deals with imperfect competition. Now, if we think back to the last few chapters, okay, we talked about purely competitive markets, and that was one chapter. And then we talked about an analysis of purely competitive markets. That was another chapter. And then we looked at monopolies. That was another chapter. And now we're looking at imperfect competition. Imperfect competition is that market structure that is in the middle. So if I were to take a look at imperfect competition, it occurs when an individual firm, by virtue of its size relative to the market, has some, and the critical word is some degree of control, but not complete control, over the industry and the quantity supplied or the price. Like a monopoly now, it can affect the quantity supplied or it can affect the price, but it can't affect both, one or the other. So you think of imperfect competition, there are lots and lots and lots of examples of imperfect competition because that's really where the market is. If we were to think about, do we live in a purely competitive environment? Do we live in a monopoly environment? Do we live in... No, we don't. We don't live in a purely competitive world, and we don't live in a monopoly world. We live in an environment that fits somewhere in between. In fact, if you were to think about it as a continuum, like I've done here, the purely competitive market being on the left, which is all open to competition, lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers, selling identical goods, and really the consumer has absolute choice in pure competition. The consumer can go and decide to buy, not buy. What the market is what's going to dictate the price on it. It really is a free-for-all in terms of everybody is selling the same thing, so the consumer has that choice of buying whatever it wants from whoever it wants. On the opposite end of the extreme over here on monopoly, we've got a situation where we've got one seller, one single seller, who sells that item, and that one single seller is the industry. In fact, you know, it's very rare, but one company could be theoretically the whole industry and have 100% market share. In that case, that's a monopoly. And we saw that a monopoly has, the monopoly company has absolute control over price or absolute control over the quantity supplied. It doesn't have control over both, but it has one or the other. And the consumer is really at the mercy of that supplier. The consumer still has choice. He can buy it or he cannot buy it. But the fact of the matter is that it is very much at the mercy of the supplier. So those are theoretical constructs, okay? It is very, very rare to find a purely competitive business or a pure monopoly. Most companies that we deal with in North America, in our neck of the woods, in the civilized world, in the first world, in the developed countries, fall into this category of imperfect competition, which is the middle ground between the two. And that middle ground between the two, we can define two broad categories within that middle ground. Towards the pure competitive side, we've got something called monopolistic competition. And monopolistic competition is characterized by a lot of small firms in the business, a lot of freedom, entry and exit, very similar to pure competition. But the thing is that because there's a lot of them, not an infinite number of them, they do have some degree of control over the price, because the products are somewhat different than one another, or we're going to be told that they're somewhat different than one another, okay? So the companies will work on the basis of making their products stand out from all the rest, which is known as product differentiation. The price, where the companies don't have full control over price is something that they can set, yes, but the market, again, still has the ability to buy it or sell it. Buy it or not buy it. Now, so there's a lot of firms that sit in that monopolistically competitive environment, a lot of firms. On the right side, towards the monopoly side, we have this thing called the oligopoly. The oligopoly means two very large suppliers. So 2, 3, 4, but we're dealing with Very low numbers of sellers, so very few firms, and those firms tend to be very large, okay? Like airlines, for example. They tend to be large, capital-intensive businesses. Entry into that market, because it is so large, because the business is so large, and because it's so capital intensive, is very challenging, because you got to raise a lot of money in order to get into that business. You know, it's not for poor people to start an oligopoly. It is just impossible. There's just too much money involved to get an oligopoly started. So it's hard to break into. Not impossible, but hard. Again, like monopolistic competition, the competition is usually based on factors other than price. Price has an impact, sure. People are going to buy more at a lower price and less at a higher price. But the fact is, you need to differentiate your product. And the oligopoly, the good thing with the oligopoly is, from an oligopolist point of view, is they have a lot of control over the price, very similar to a monopolist. The other thing with a monopolist, with an oligopolist, very close to a monopolist, is this thing called mutual interdependence. What this means is, because there are so few sellers, that the movement of one causes a ripple effect in the other. If one changes the prices, the others are probably going to change the price. If one goes in one direction, the others are probably going to go in that direction. So they all chase one another. They're very interdependent. You know, if we think about airlines, for example, airlines, if one affects their prices, the next one's jumps their prices the very next day. They're very reluctant to drop their prices. If one offers a level of service, the other one will probably offer a very similar level of service. If one offers a destination, the other one will probably offer a similar destination. So this is what I mean by mutual interdependence. Okay, so those are the things that we're looking at. We're looking at that middle ground in this particular unit. And as I say, in terms of imperfect competition, we got an individual firm, by virtue of its size relative to the market, has some degree of control over the industry and the quantity supplied or the price. Now, if we think in Canada, for example, imperfect competition is in the large retail sector, okay? You think about Walmart. Walmart got about 35% of all sales. Canadian Tire has a good chunk as well. Loblaws has a good chunk. Sobeys has a good chunk. And now, in the last 10 years, we've seen non-traditional retailers enter, the Amazons of the world, or the online sellers. Particularly in the pandemic now, they have really, really increased their sales. So it's not perfectly competitive, but it still has elements of perfect competition. So what do they compete on? How can you, as a buyer, tell the difference or have a preference from one supplier over the other? And this is what the companies focus on. They have to make themselves stand out. So firms operating in imperfect competition tend not to compete so much on price, because really they're going after one another for the same customer, and there's not a lot to be had. If I change my price, you're going to change your price. So you're going to chase me wherever I go. Rather than price, what these firms tend to want to do is think about how they can stand out. The most common way to stand out is through what's called product differentiation. And if we think about our world is full of products that differentiate themselves from other products, or try to differentiate themselves from other products. No matter what they are, one will argue that it has different features, advantages, and benefits of its unique characteristics are different than everyone else. So product differentiation, by definition, is an attempt for a firm to distinguish its products from that of its competitors by doing such things as developing a recognized brand name, a product logo, specialized packaging, securing a superior location, like if you had a storefront, or developing a reputation for exceptional service, or engaging in product redevelopment and improvement, or developing an effective advertising strategy. So we got lots and lots of things that companies can do in order to make themselves stand out. So marketing really comes in here, and marketing becomes important. So I just wanted to go down through each of these key ones and take a look at them, because this is the critical thing that you want to take away from this chapter is, how can these companies differentiate themselves? Well, The first way is by a logo. And when we think about a logo is a symbol such as the Nike swoosh or the apple with a bite taken out of it. These logos are instantly recognizable by consumers. And they also carry with them certain values. BMW, we think that it is, a high quality car that is a desired car. It is an aspirational product. People would like to be driving a BMW. Chevy probably just doesn't have that same aspirational fact to it, As a new buyer or first-time buyer, yeah, maybe a Chevy. But nobody dreams of owning a Chevy all their life. So what the logo does is it gives that instantaneous brand recognition by a shape or design. And companies need good, solid logos. So there's a whole industry out there designing logos. That industry that designs logos also develops brand names. And brand names often are a descriptor of what the product does. Okay? There is a company out there based in Ontario, and I thought they probably have the best possible name I've ever seen of any company. It's a company called Skyjack. And what Skyjack do is they make these scissor lifts, which allow, it's a glorified ladder is what it is. It allows workers to rise up in height, to go up to different floors or paint a ceiling or do something like that. But the scissor lift reaches for the sky. So Skyjack is a good brand name. It kind of describes what the product is as it does it, right? Other products are not so descriptive, like Apple. We always think of Apple as a fruit company. That after all is what Forrest Gump thought it was. The distinctive brand names are not necessarily related to the product, but still, it doesn't matter. When we tell of Apple, we think computers. We don't think apples or watches or things like that. The good quality location. In marketing, there's 3 basic rules of marketing: is location, location, location. And location is critical, and that includes online. In today's age, for example, I think about Clarenville companies. Clarenville companies are notoriously poor at being online. They're very traditional retailers. Very few of them, if any of them, save for Mercer's Marine, have an online presence of any substance. And so even though they might want to be on Manitoba Drive or on Shoal Harbor Drive, they're very traditional bricks and mortar type organizations. We don't have here, but if we go to California or places like that, those locations are critical. There's lots of people there, but they also have a virtual presence too that is very well executed. The level of service. Hotels in particular differentiate themselves on the level of service. The Four Seasons Hotel, for example, will do anything for you. If you call up, you need a newspaper from China, they'll find you a newspaper from China. So, these types of things are what makes that hotel stand out from others. You're paying for it, no doubt, but again, it is part of the hotel's reputation. Product development. A lot of companies are keen on product development. Apple is a good example too. The Apple iPhone changes every year. There's a new edition of the iPhone. The idea is that it comes out just prior to Christmas. And that's what they do, is they constantly upgrade their product, and they're very focused on product development, staying ahead of the competition. And finally, we got advertising. And if we think about advertising, really all of the ones above fall under this big umbrella of advertising. We could think of advertising as kind of like all of those things put into one. And it's really communicating with the customer, advertising. And if we think about advertising in terms of monopolistic competition, there's a lot of arguments out there whether advertising is good or bad. The pro arguments are listed here. They provide customers with vital information to make decisions. They enhance competition between firms because you can tell your customer that my product has a certain feature that the other one may not. there's arguments that because advertising exists, more product is sold, and as a result, companies can get economies of scale as they produce more and more products and keep prices down. So lower prices because of advertising is an argument. A lot of people counter to say that's not true, but the fact of the matter is that there is an argument out there that advertising allows companies to get economies of scales by selling huge volumes of product, and that means that they can afford to lower their prices. And finally, it finances magazines and newspapers. Now, if we think about TV shows, if we think about the importance of advertising, you know, newspapers are a dying product. They're at the end of their life cycle. We've seen here in Clarenville, for example, the packet has disappeared. A lot of the small community newspapers have died in Canada. The reason is they can't get advertising anymore because the small businesses that exist are putting their money online. And, you know, so it's impacting the ability of those papers. So certainly advertising does finance magazines and television shows and newspapers and any of the traditional media. But, you know, advertising has its share of people that say, no, this does nothing for us in our world. They say, you know, that advertising, if anything, is non-informative. It gives us information that's skewed and that it is not necessarily true. You know, if I'm told that this product is the best thing since sliced bread because it slices, dices, and makes all kinds of interesting gadgets just in time for Christmas, it's $99.95, it's available on TV. Realistically, when you get it, you'll probably never use it. Because if it's being sold on TV, it's not good enough to be sold in stores. And even though it sounds so good, the reality is it doesn't live up to its reputation. A knife is probably better than a Vegematic because the Vegematic takes too much effort and energy to operate. So advertising generates a lot of sales that are not necessary. It creates a consumerism type of economy. There's arguments in that. And this whole thing creates waste. And we've seen the amount of waste that is in our society and how much garbage we throw out and how much junk we buy that we never use. The advertising also encourages concentration. And the thought is that the large firms are the only ones who can afford to advertise. So as a result, they get bigger and the smaller ones get smaller. And all we're left with is, well, sort of monopolies or sort of oligopolies because there's very few sellers who survive, and as a result, we're going into a less competitive environment rather than a more competitive environment. And obviously, someone has to pay for the advertising, so the argument is that advertising drives up. You know, if a car company is spending $500 million on a TV commercial during the Super Bowl, you got to ask who's paying for that? Well, ultimately, it's the consumer. So there are 4 key characteristics of this monopolistically competitive market. So I just want to go back and start this slide. So we're looking at this monopolistic competition here, okay? So we need to be aware of these 4 key characteristics. First of all, the industry has a lot of small firms. With over 100 firms vying for market share, no one has dominance. So, you know, if we think about the snowmobile industry of the 1960s, there was over 100 firms making snowmobiles. And nobody had any dominance. It was only a very small industry. It's made up of small suppliers. Freedom of entry and exit. Because it was such an industry back in the 60s, many manufacturers entered the market, and many in 1973, when the price of oil went up, left the market. There was freedom of entry and exit. They had some degree of control over price. Manufacturers in these competitive environments still have some degree of price because the number of manufacturers is not infinite. It's relatively small. Even with 100 manufacturers, for example, there is a price range. And the key thing is with monopolistic competition, as we've just spoken about, is this idea of differentiation. We got to make our product stand out from our competitors. The other one, oligopolies, and again, I'll just go back to this here. Oligopoly, which is the other type of imperfect competition. If we were to look at oligopolies, they can be found both in industries that produce differentiated products and industries that produce standardized products. So they're kind of sitting in the middle of be it products that are somewhat slightly different or the same sort of thing, a more commodity type market. Oligopoly industries, there's lots of them out there. Tobacco, which is really a commodity. Breweries, which we could argue is a commodity beer. Automobiles, appliances, electronics, and batteries. And standardized products would be things like steel, aluminum, lumber, and pulp. If we ask what are the characteristics of oligopolies, here they are. Oligopoly industries have 5 key. It's dominated by large firms. As I say, they tend to be capital intensive. Entry is not easy because they are capital intensive. There's non-price factors that come into play that say, okay, our product is different than their product because of something other than price. Each firm has a good bit of control because there's so few firms. And there's this mutual interdependence. If I do it, you'll probably follow me. There is a neat little term that we can use. It's a measure, like a barometer of how competitive a market is or how concentrated a market is, and it's called the concentration ratio. So monopolistic competition is a market containing many relatively small firms, whereas oligopoly is a market with a few large firms. One way of emphasizing the distinction is to compare what's called industry concentration. So if we're trying to figure out, is this more monopolistic competition or more oligopoly? What we're going to do is we're going to take the top 4 firms in the industry, okay? We're looking for, we rank the firms, the total number of firms in the industry by their sales or profit or whatever, usually sales. And we're going to look at, of the total industry, so let's assume that total industry sales is 320, let's assume that total industry sales, is $400 million, okay? $400 million for whatever the industry is. The top 4 firms sell $320 million worth of product. So in other words, the top 4 have 320 400ths, which is 80% of the market. That is what is called the concentration ratio. So we take the top 4 firms, we add up their total sales, we compare it with the total sales for the industry, and that will give us a concentration ratio. So let's say, for example, the top 4 firms sold $400 million worth of product, and the total industry is $400 million worth of products. That's a 100% concentration ratio. So we need to look at concentration ratios. In monopolistic competition, with relatively small firms, concentration ratios would be a lot less, say 2%, 1%, 0.5%. In oligopolies, it will be up past 50%. It'll be a much higher rate. So if we think about airlines in Canada, for example, you think about top 4 airlines. Well, there's Air Canada, WestJet, Porter, and it's hard to think of another large one. There's really 3 large flyers. And if we think about Air Canada and WestJet and Porter, they fly about 90% of the people in Canada. So very much an oligopoly. Now, if we look at convenience stores in Canada, there's thousands and thousands of convenience stores. They're not all owned by the same company. We could look at the concentration ratio there, the top 4, and we'd probably find that Sobeys owns a good number of them. Loblaws probably only a good number of them, but probably it still only represents 10% of the market. So that would indicate very much a monopolistically competitive or less concentrated ratio. So that concentration ratio is very important. And if we look at this example here, the Canadian grommet industry consists of 10 companies whose annual sales are shown. Calculate the 4-firm concentration ratio for this industry. So we've got 10 companies here, and you can see that what we need to do is look at the top 4. So A is 22, C is 17, F is 15. And we don't have to worry about the rest. That's not one single unit. So 22, 15, 17, and 12. So if we add those numbers up, 22 and 17 is 39. And 15 is 54. And 12 is 66. So 66 of the total. So what is the total? 22 and 6 is 28. 38, 45, 55, 57, 65, 80, 92. So we got about 60 odd of 90. So it's about a 60 odd percent ratio. I don't have the exact number because I just did quick math on it. But what you do is you take the top 4 and you add up whatever the total is for the top 4, then add up the total for industry, divide one by the other, and that will give you the concentration ratio. So it's about 70% here. So we would argue that if we had what type of industry is this? This is very much on the oligopoly side. The top 4 have a good chunk of the market. Any questions on that? Now that we've looked at the oligopoly and the imperfect competition, and we know that there are a lot of these, particularly in the oligopoly, there are a lot of these very large firms out there. And if there, let's say that, for example, there's only 4 firms or 5 firms, the top, it's a highly concentrated. We're going to look at it and say, gee, why don't those firms get together and create a monopoly by working together? And there is a huge, huge push in terms of incentive for companies in an oligopoly environment to what's called collude, or come together to act as one. Okay? There's also a huge, huge push for them to compete against one another because they're looking for increasing their market share. So they're kind of a yin and yang. They're drawn together and forced apart. But if the forces on competition come together, they will agree to not compete against one another, and that's what's called collusion. And these collusion type operations are known in the market as cartels. And that's an overt, blatant collusion where a bunch of normally competing large firms get together and say, we're going to act as one. Now, if we think about, this is pretty common in the world. If we look at countries, countries are always in the process of creating cartels. Canada, the United States, and Mexico created a big cartel called the North American Free Trade Agreement. The European Union. Okay, so nations get together to say, let's not compete, let's work together. So there's an incentive. But companies do as well. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries is a classic example of this. Back in 1973, they got together, it's a bunch of companies from various countries that were producing oil, usually in Saudi Arabia area. They got together and they basically agreed to jack up the price of oil by limiting their production. They agreed production limits, and the price of oil doubled overnight. This caused severe economic grief across the world, not to mention driving up the price of gas. So cartels are illegal in the sense within Canada. There are legislations against cartels, but certainly in the world, they're out there. They do exist. And there's a tremendous, the only thing we got working on us now, like, for example, right now you ask, why is the price of gas gotten so low? Well, the gas has gotten low now because of an anti-cartel. There's a whole bunch of cheating or, you know, and whenever we think of a cartel, one country or one company can get up on another one by producing more, okay? Even though they agreed in the cartel, they made an agreement not to produce anymore or to toe the line. If one company, there's a lot of incentive for companies to break rank. And that's exactly what happened in the world right now, why the price of gas is low, because Iran or Saudi Arabia and Russia are all kind of fighting against one another over the price of oil, or what's good and what's bad. And they are producing oil like gangbusters, and it's dropping the price of oil. And as a result, oil in Canada right now, you know, look at what's going on offshore here, very little. Look at what's going on in Alberta, very little. Because there is an abundance of oil on the market at a low price, thanks to our cartel falling apart. The last thing that I want to introduce here is something called the kink demand curve. And this is a very interesting economics concept, okay? And it is not overly complicated, but it takes a little bit to get your head around. And effectively, a kink demand curve occurs when the demand curve is not a straight line, but has different elasticity at different prices. Okay, so I want you to take a look at this. I'll just, let me just bring this up to the presenter mode and get my, let's assume the price is right here. Okay, now this is a market that is a fairly competitive market. It's a monopolistically competitive market. Let's assume it's an oligopoly. Okay, so there's two or three large companies. Okay, so the price is right here. This is the price, and this is the quantity that's being sold at that price. Now, one of the companies, let's pretend that one of the companies in that group of companies that are in that oligopoly say to themselves, geez, you know, I'd like to make more money by driving up my price. Okay, I'd like to make more money by driving up my price. If I could increase prices, that would be great. I could make a lot more money. However, they're looking over their shoulder as they're thinking that and saying, well, you know, if I increase my prices, that means consumers might go buy from everyone else who may not increase their prices. In fact, that's probably what's going to happen. If one company thinks it can rise prices, its rivals may not rise their prices, okay? And that would mean that every customer would go over and buy from them. So this would be this here, okay? This part of the demand curve here and here represent changes in the price. Okay, let's assume the price is going to go up. Let's go on the basis of our prices going up. So let's drive our price up. Up. What we're going to find is if we put our price right here, let's say, we're going to notice that the quantity that we sell as a company is going to drop. Okay? And in fact, that's probably going to be reinforced because the other companies, if they see that we're losing market share to them because we just drove up our prices, they're probably not going to increase their prices. Now, because of this, we're into elastic demand up here. And that means that we're actually going to lose revenue by driving our prices up. Customers are going to walk away from us. So anything above the market price will tend to have an elastic demand curve. In other words, if I were to be a separate company that goes to jack up my prices, I'm going to lose customers and lose revenue. However, if the situation was the opposite, okay, we're in the process of thinking that we'd like to change our price. We're in this group of companies. There's only so many of us. It's a bit of an oligopoly. And we're saying to ourselves, you know, maybe we could get more money, more revenue by decreasing our prices. If we decreased our prices, we could capture a bigger share of the market and as a result make some money. So what happens if we decrease our prices? You'll notice that the demand curve is very steep. That's because all the other companies will chase us down. So if we drop our prices, they're going to drop their prices too. So we're not going to increase our revenue. And again, this is the problem. So if it thinks that rising prices, our rivals will not rise prices, and that will result in elastic demand above the prevailing price. If we think that we can decrease our price down here, that decrease will be matched by our rivals for sure. They'll chase us down, which result in inelastic demand below the prevailing price, and we're not going to make any money. So the kink demand curve kind of indicates that if one firm tries to break ranks, what it's saying is if one firm in that oligopoly tries to break ranks, if it goes up in price, it will lose revenue, and if it goes down in price, it will lose revenue. So because of the kink demand curve, it indicates that there's probably not going to be much of an effort to adjust prices, because either way, if one company were to change its prices, it's a losing proposition for that company, regardless if it's up or down. And we could think about an example of that with kinked ear. We'll take a look at that. Let's take an example of an airline. Kink ear is one of a half dozen airlines serving the city of Bend. Traditionally, all the airlines serving Bend have competed on non-price factors. Bend, for example, offers snacks on their flights, while others may not. Bend is contemplating rising its price 10%. It reasons that if it does this, the other airlines may not rise prices. Bend, therefore, will lose customers and its revenues will drop. So we can't put our prices up because they'll go to the competitors and revenues will drop. In economic terms, prices above Bend's current price are said to be elastic demand for its flights. On the other hand, to secure more customers, Bend decides to drop its prices 10%. Guaranteed, its rivals would be much more inclined to follow suit and drop their prices accordingly. So would Bend attract new customers? Probably not. In fact, revenues would fall because of lower prices. In economic terms, prices below the current price faced an inelastic demand and a much steeper, more vertical demand curve. I want you to be aware of how this kink demand works, and that is that if one firm drops its prices, it's probably going to lose revenue out of it, or if that same one firm increases prices, it's probably going to lose money out of it, because the elasticity of demand changes going up and down. Okay,